Thank you, Cathaoirleach. In relation to previous speakers, the Sinn Féin side of the House talking about U-turns and Karma Sutras, I seem to remember Deputy O'Brien recommending and proposing a commission to examine water charges. Now that there is one, they want it gone. I seem to remember Sinn Féin talking about there should be no refunds in relation to those that have paid under the failed regime that was brought in by the last government. Now that there is a possibility that there may be refunds, you don't want them. When that same failed regime was brought into force by the last government, you said you wouldn't pay your water charges individually. Now you say you would pay them. Now you say you wouldn't. So, if you're talking about Karma Sutra and U-turns, maybe you could think of Houdini and contortionists in respect of your own stance on this issue. It's safe to say, listen, I acknowledge, as any Democrat would, as any member of the House would, the right of Sinn Féin to put down motions in this House. It is obviously your prerogative and their prerogative about what form they may take or what they may be or how they feel that their aims may be met by bringing forward such motions. And I don't necessarily want to go over old ground about how and why we find ourselves at this juncture, or how we found ourselves at the juncture after the last election in February, when one had to consider the people's verdict in relation to the failed water regime introduced by the last government, amongst many other things which contributed towards the result that we had. Suffice to say that that election brought about an inconclusive result insofar as that there was no clear majority and there was no clear preference given by the people in relation to a government or a Taoiseach. Now, some of us in this House took our responsibilities thereafter quite seriously, and some didn't. And I know for our part, having failed to achieve the requisite number for Micheál Martin to lead government in relation to the election by the people, we then sought 3 times to put his name forward as a leader of a government in the House, but with no success. And as Republicans and as Democrats, we recognised that decision. And again, as I said earlier, took our responsibility seriously and sought to give credit to the electorate and allow the electorate a government be formed out of the result they gave us, as inconclusive or convoluted as it might have been. But it was their decision, and their decision had to be respected. Having failed to achieve to lead government, as I said, we saw fit to bring about a scenario or a situation or a facilitation for a government to be formed, which had to deal with many pressing items, some a lot more pressing than this very issue that we are talking about, in relation to housing, in relation to health, in relation to education, in relation to regional development, in relation to provision of jobs in the regions, and to policing, and many more items besides. As I said, others saw fit not to entertain the prospect of entering into that process. They would rather have foisted another election on the people, and maybe that's what they want to do now. And I'm of the firm belief now, as I was then, that the people don't want an election. The people want a government, the people want issues, they want results, and one has to be focus driven, one has to be interested in resolutions and results and achieving aims, and to give value to the votes that were cast in our favour and others. And in allowing that process to come to a conclusion, it was obvious from our perspective that we had to negotiate and compromise with the likes of Fine Gael, who had a completely opposing view to us in relation to water, in order for us to allow a pathway to deal with that issue be put in place, so as a government and the Dáil could deal with other pressing items for which the people had voted, for which the people had sought there be a more fair, a more inclusive delivery of public services, and that there be a split of 2 to 1 in relation to public services over taxation cuts, despite what the outgoing government had sought to do in their efforts to seek the approval of the electorate. And in that pathway, in order to deal with this very divisive issue, and having gone into a negotiation process, one cannot expect to reach a conclusion and have the same position at the end of that process. And God knows Sinn Féin above everybody else should know that, considering the path they've come in another jurisdiction in our country. But the confidence and supply agreement contained and in the counter motion of the government that we support, having previously been proposed by the previous speaker, it seeks and asks the Dáil to support the ongoing work of the Expert Commission on Domestic Public Water Services, including its recent and public consultation, with a view to producing recommendations by the end of November. Nothing has changed in that regard. We support the future consideration of those recommendations of the Expert Commission on Domestic Water Charges by a special Oireachtas committee, which will endeavour to make its own recommendations by the end of February. Nothing has changed in that regard either, and we continue to support and honour that commitment. And ultimately, a decision of the Oireachtas on the future funding model for the delivery of domestic water services and water and wastewater services will be made by the end of March 2017. And at that stage, Fine Gael, as leaders of the existing government, have committed to sponsor the legislation as devised or as agreed by the Oireachtas, having gone through that process. A full and thorough process that analyses all options, but ultimately asks the Dáil to make a decision. And that's how this issue will be dealt with. While at the same time, and parallel to that, as I said to you, we can go forward with a government that can make recommendations to deal with the housing crisis, can make recommendations in an upcoming budget in relation to how public services are spent in the forthcoming year in a different direction and shape and manner in which they were dealt with by the previous administration. That's the commitment that we gave, that's the commitment we signed up to, and that's the value we gave to those that voted in our favour. And we want to honour that and continue to honour that. And I will vote against your motion, which has no legal basis, the same as I voted against a previous one in recent months immediately after the election. And if we had not entered into that negotiation, if we had not allowed ourselves to be in a position to seek the support of the rest of the parliamentary party to facilitate the formation of a government, there is no doubt you and others would have brought forward these motions and a government would not be able to function, and we would have gone to the country again, and maybe we would be in the same position as Spain are in, having gone through a process of the last 9 or 10 months and no government. And that's not what the people want. And maybe not, but I can rest assure you, you check it out with the public, they do not want an election at this stage. And I stand over that commitment to the people, and I recognise the decision that people made, as convoluted as it was, and as well as we did. But we didn't win an election. Nobody won an election, no clear majority, but this House made a decision thereafter to put a government in place to deal with the very issues, many which more include that of water. And I'll stand over that, my party will stand over that, and that's the commitment we made to the public, and we'll stand before the public again and ask their deliberation and accept the consequences, irrespective of what they are. But we will have achieved some results and given value to the vote, which is something you cannot say in relation to the motion you have before the House today.
Could I ask the deputies to allow Deputy Cowan without interruption, please?
So I'll be back to the point that I made. I'll go back to the point that I made. I'll go back to the point that I made, Deputy O'Snuddy and others and your colleagues that are here. As I said, it is your prerogative to put forward whatever motion you see fit, based on the support you have, or based on the commitment you've made, or based on the understanding you have as to how the democratic process works in this House. And it's time, you've basically come back out from under your rock, because it's under a rock you went when a government needed to be formed, when there was real decisions to be taken, and real interpretation of the result that the people had handed this Dáil. You went under a rock. You're back out now and more luck to you. Play your games. Play your games. Have your time in the sun. Provide your stunt. I'll clear the stage. We'll clear the stage for you, no problem. You can strut your stuff and flatter to deceive, because that's all you've ever done. I've never seen anything else. I would expect nothing less. Thank you very much.
Could I now call on Deputy Moynihan?